January 17, 1991. 02:40 a.m. local time. The western Iraqi desert, flat, empty, and black beneath a moonless sky. You are standing on the edge of a barren airstrip carved into sand and rock, watching two shapes emerge from the darkness. Their rotors turn slowly at first, then faster, chopping the cold night air into a low, predatory thunder. The smell of fuel and dust hangs heavy. Red cockpit lights glow faintly through armored glass. These are AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, machines Soviet generals have openly mocked for years. In Moscow, senior armored officers once dismissed them as fragile, overcomplicated toys. Helicopters, they said, could never survive against real air defenses. Against tanks, they would be shredded. Against a modern army, they would die screaming. Tonight, those assumptions are about to be buried in the sand. Inside the lead Apache sits Chief Warrant Officer Jeff Nance, hands steady on the controls, eyes locked forward through night vision goggles that turn darkness into a grainy green world. Beside him, his gunner scans the horizon, watching symbols flicker across the targeting display. Somewhere ahead, unseen, silent, stands the Iraqi early warning radar network. Soviet-designed, Soviet-trained crews, Soviet doctrine. The mission is simple and brutal. Punch a hole through Iraq's air defense shield. No jets, no bombers, no warning, just helicopters. At 02:40, the Apaches lift off, skimming low over the desert floor. They fly below radar coverage, hugging terrain so flat it offers almost no concealment. Every minute is a risk. A single alert sent to Baghdad could trigger the entire Iraqi air defense system. In Soviet doctrine, this is madness. Helicopters are not supposed to lead wars. They are supposed to follow tanks, not hunt them. The flight splits into two elements, weaving through darkness at barely treetop height. Pilots fly by instruments and instinct, trusting machines their critics believe are too vulnerable to survive this deep behind enemy lines. Then, movement. On the horizon, faint geometric shapes appear through night vision. Tall masts, radar dishes, power generators humming quietly in the dark. An Iraqi early warning site, part of the same Soviet-style integrated air defense network that once terrified NATO planners across Europe. The Apaches slow, hover, lock targets. For a brief moment, the desert is silent. Then hell erupts. Hellfire missiles streak forward, invisible until impact. Radar arrays explode in white flashes, disintegrating in seconds. Power stations erupt, antennas collapse, secondary detonations ripple through the site as ammunition cooks off. The entire engagement lasts less than 4 minutes. When it ends, the radar station is gone, and Iraq is blind. Hundreds of miles away, coalition aircraft are already moving, but the Iraqi defenders don't know it yet. Their warning systems are dead, their screens are dark, their commanders are confused. Soviet doctrine assumes layered defense, time to react, time to reposition. There is no time. The Apaches turn east, accelerating away from the burning wreckage. They have done what armored divisions and airstrikes were never designed to do: decapitate the battlefield before it even wakes up. As dawn creeps closer, something unprecedented unfolds across Iraq. American armor surges forward, and waiting for it, spread across the desert in long, confident lines, are Iraqi tank formations. T-55s, T-62s, T-72s, steel descendants of the Red Army's proudest legacy.
many of them positioned exactly as Soviet manuals prescribed, dug in, camouflaged, supported by infantry, confident in numbers, armor, and firepower. Confident because for decades, Soviet generals taught the world one immutable truth: tanks decide wars, helicopters merely support them. By mid-morning, the first Apache squadrons are rearmed, refueled, and airborne again. This time, they are not hunting radar, they are hunting armor. Flying low over smoke-streaked desert, Apache crews begin detecting heat signatures, dozens at a time. Engines, turrets, vehicles idling in tight formations, tank columns. From above, through thermal sights, they glow like targets painted by fire itself. Inside one Iraqi command post, officers peer through binoculars, squinting into the sky. They hear helicopter noise, but dismiss it. Helicopters. Too few, too weak, no serious threat. Somewhere, an Iraqi officer trained by Soviet advisors repeats the logic he was taught. Tanks fear jets, not helicopters. The Apaches descend, and the battlefield is about to be rewritten. The first Hellfire missile hits without warning. From the perspective of the Apache crew, it is clinical, almost unreal. A glowing rectangle appears in the gunner's thermal sight, engine heat blooming white against the cooler sand. Range numbers settle, the targeting reticle tightens. Laser on. A quiet confirmation tone. Then the missile is gone. It arcs upward briefly, then dives, fast, precise, slamming through the turret roof of a T-72 with surgical violence. The tank does not explode immediately. For a split second, it simply stops. Then its ammunition detonates. The turret lifts off the hull as if punched from below, spinning end over end before crashing back into the sand. The Apache banks away. Behind it, another missile strikes, then another. Across the desert, Iraqi tank crews scramble. Hatches fly open, men shout, engines rev, turrets begin rotating wildly, searching for targets they cannot see. The enemy is above them, and they were never trained for this. Soviet armored doctrine, refined from Kursk to Cold War Europe, assumed the sky would be contested by aircraft, moving fast and high. Tanks were designed to survive that. Thick frontal armor, low silhouettes, smoke, dispersal. What the doctrine never truly accounted for was persistent, hovering precision death. The Apaches do not rush, they do not charge. They circle at standoff range, outside effective machine gun fire, firing missiles that strike from angles tank armor was never meant to withstand. Top-down kills, turret roofs, engine decks, the weakest points. Inside Iraqi armored units, panic spreads faster than orders. Radios crackle with overlapping voices. Commanders try to establish firing sectors, but the helicopters refuse to stay where they are expected. They pop up, strike, vanish behind terrain so subtle it barely exists. Dry riverbeds, slight ridgelines, folds in the desert invisible from the ground. Some tank crews fire blindly, sending heavy shells screaming into empty darkness. Others attempt to flee, breaking formation, colliding with one another in the confusion. The Apache pilots watch it all unfold through stabilized optics. They are calm. They have trained for this. Back in the Soviet Union, senior generals once scoffed at American reliance on attack helicopters. They believed such machines would be annihilated in minutes against a real mechanized force. Helicopters were vulnerable, they said, fragile, dependent on surprise. But this is not a raid. This is systematic destruction. By midday, entire Iraqi battalions have ceased to exist as organized units. Tanks burn where they were parked, supply trucks are shredded, command vehicles, identified by antenna clusters, are destroyed first, isolating formations before the killing even begins. This is not accidental. This is design. American doctrine has inverted the battlefield. The tanks are no longer the hunters, They are the hunted. As Apache crews cycle back to refuel and rearm, new formations move in. The rhythm becomes relentless. Detect, target, destroy, withdraw, repeat. Each strike compounds the psychological damage. Survivors later describe the sound, the distant thump of rotors that never seemed to leave, the knowledge that the helicopters could see everything while remaining invisible themselves, the terror of sitting inside a steel coffin knowing the next missile would come from above. In one Iraqi unit, officers abandoned vehicles entirely, ordering crews to scatter on foot. It makes no difference. Without tanks, the unit has no purpose, no cohesion, no defense. The Soviet assumption that mass could absorb losses collapses in real time. Mass only creates more targets. By afternoon, the desert is littered with blackened hulls. Smoke columns rise in every direction, visible for miles. Coalition ground forces advance almost unopposed, encountering wreckage rather than resistance. American tank crews moving forward are stunned by what they see. Rows of destroyed Iraqi armor, often untouched from the front, pierced cleanly from above. Some vehicles still have full ammunition loads. Others show no sign of return fire at all. The Apaches have done their work. In Moscow, military observers tracking reports from Baghdad begin to realize the scale of what is happening. This is not attrition. This is not exchange. This is asymmetric annihilation. Soviet doctrine prized the idea of time to maneuver, time to respond, time to bring mass to bear. But helicopters operating inside an integrated sensor and command network have stolen that time completely. By the time an Iraqi tank commander understands he is under attack, the missile is already inbound, and there is no counter, no air cover, no radar warning, no effective anti-helicopter screen. The very machines Soviet generals laughed at are now dictating the pace of the war. As night falls, Apache crews land again, exhausted but composed. They log targets destroyed, coordinates, ammunition expended, damage assessed. The numbers are staggering, and the war is not even a full day old. Somewhere deep within the Soviet general staff, a realization begins to take shape, quiet, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. If helicopters can do this to tanks, what does that mean for the future of armored warfare itself?
In Moscow, the first reports arrive before the full scope of the disaster is clear. They come through diplomatic channels, intelligence summaries, intercepted Iraqi communications, fragmented, contradictory, and increasingly disturbing. Soviet military analysts gather inside windowless briefing rooms, standing over maps of southern Iraq and Kuwait, red markers already cluttering the paper. At first, the tone is dismissive. Iraqi incompetence, some say, poor discipline, inferior crews, Western exaggeration. But as the hours pass, the data refuses to cooperate. Entire Iraqi armored brigades have gone silent. Tank battalions trained on Soviet doctrine, equipped with Soviet-designed armor, are no longer responding. Recon flights report vast kill zones, long lines of destroyed vehicles, many untouched from the front, penetrated from above. That detail stops the room cold. Top-down kills. One analyst circles the phrase in red pencil. This was not how tanks were supposed to die. For decades, Soviet armored theory had been built around survivability through mass and momentum. Tanks advanced together, supported by air defenses, artillery, and layered command structures. Losses were expected, but manageable. Wars were won by absorbing punishment and continuing forward. What the Americans have demonstrated is something fundamentally different. They are not fighting the tanks. They are fighting the system that allows tanks to exist.
Apache helicopters, operating at night and in poor visibility, have severed command vehicles first, then logistics, then armor, piece by piece. The Iraqis are not being defeated in battle. They are being disconnected, isolated, until each tank becomes an individual target. A Soviet general, gray-haired, a veteran of Cold War planning for a war that never came, leans back in his chair and says quietly, "This is not aviation support." No one argues. This is not helicopters flying alongside tanks. This is helicopters replacing the role tanks once played. In previous wars, air power softened defenses so armored forces could advance. Here, the helicopters are the spear. The tanks merely follow through wreckage. By the second day of the conflict, Soviet observers begin cross-referencing American doctrine manuals, exercises, and procurement decisions from the previous decade. Patterns emerge. The Apache was never meant to fight alone. It was designed to fight inside a network. Satellites, AWACS, ground controllers, secure communications, real-time intelligence. Every Apache crew sees a version of the battlefield that Iraqi commanders never do. This is not bravery alone. It is information dominance. Soviet doctrine had emphasized centralized control, decisions made high, orders pushed down. The American model unfolding in Iraq is the opposite. Authority flows downward. Pilots decide, gunners engage. Opportunities are exploited in seconds, not hours. In one intercepted Iraqi transmission, a brigade commander reports helicopters attacking his position. The timestamp is already obsolete by the time it reaches Baghdad. By the time permission to respond is granted, the unit no longer exists. For Soviet planners, this is the nightmare scenario, a force that does not wait, a force that does not mass before striking, a force that destroys faster than orders can be written. Inside the Kremlin's military advisory circles, the tone shifts, the jokes stop, the laughter that once followed mention of American flying tanks evaporates. Instead, questions begin to circulate, urgent, unsettling questions. How do you defend armored columns against a threat that never presents itself clearly? How do you protect tanks when the sky itself has become hostile terrain? How do you fight an enemy that can see you continuously while remaining unseen? Some suggest more air defenses, more guns, more missiles. Others shake their heads. Air defenses require detection, and detection is exactly what the Americans have removed. The Gulf War is no longer viewed as a regional conflict. It is a demonstration, a message written in burning steel. As the war continues, Apache strikes expand. They hunt retreating columns along the so-called highway of death, striking vehicles packed bumper to bumper. Fuel trucks erupt into fireballs. Armored personnel carriers are torn open. The devastation is total and recorded from above with chilling clarity. Soviet analysts study the footage frame by frame. They see crews abandoning vehicles intact, fleeing into the desert. They see tanks that never fired a shot. They see formations dissolve in minutes. The conclusion becomes unavoidable. This is not American courage versus Iraqi weakness. This is about a new way of war. A war where the first casualty is decision time. A war where armored mass, once the centerpiece of Soviet power, has become a liability. By the time the ground war officially ends, the damage to Soviet confidence is irreversible. The Red Army's proudest instrument, the tank, has not been rendered useless, but it has been rendered vulnerable. And vulnerability, in military theory, is fatal. As the last Apache crews shut down their engines and step onto the tarmac around them, still smoldering, they do not know the full impact of what they have done. They know only that their mission succeeded. What they cannot see, what none of them can see, is that thousands of miles away, inside Soviet war colleges and general staff rooms, the future of armored warfare is being rewritten in uneasy silence, and the men doing the rewriting are no longer laughing.
By the summer of 1991, the war in the desert is officially over, but inside Soviet military institutions, the conflict has only just begun. In lecture halls at the Frunze Military Academy, instructors stand before rows of officers trained to command tank divisions, mechanized armies, entire fronts. Behind them, chalkboards, once filled with arrows and breakthrough corridors, are now cluttered with unfamiliar terms: air mobile kill zones, distributed sensors, hunter-killer teams. The old diagrams no longer work. For nearly half a century, Soviet doctrine had rested on a single, unshakable premise: armored mass wins wars. Tanks, deployed in overwhelming numbers, punch through defenses, exploit gaps, and roll forward relentlessly. Air power supported the advance, artillery prepared the path, and command authority remained centralized to maintain control over vast formations. Operation Desert Storm and the Apache-led destruction of Iraqi tank columns has shattered that premise. The problem is not that tanks are obsolete. The problem is that they can no longer survive alone. Soviet analysts replay the engagements again and again. They note how Apache crews never attack randomly. They appear only after Iraqi radar coverage collapses. They strike logistics before armor. They eliminate command vehicles before firing on tanks. Every engagement follows the same pattern: isolate, confuse, destroy. This is not attrition warfare. This is systemic collapse. One colonel assigned to write an internal assessment puts it bluntly in his report: "The enemy does not defeat formations, he defeats connectivity." That sentence circulates quietly through staff offices. Connectivity. It is a word that barely existed in Soviet doctrine. The Red Army had been built to fight under conditions of jamming, disruption, and loss of communications, by relying on pre-planned orders and rigid structures. But what the Americans have shown is something different. Their forces expect disruption and thrive in it. Individual units adapt faster than centralized commands can react. The Apache embodies this shift. Each helicopter carries its own sensors, its own targeting systems, its own authority to engage. Crews coordinate with each other directly, sharing data in real time. They do not wait for approval to exploit an opening. If a column is exposed, it is destroyed before higher command even knows it exists. For Soviet planners, this is deeply unsettling. Their own attack helicopters, Mi-24 Hinds, are formidable machines, heavily armored, bristling with weapons, but they were designed for escort and suppression, not independent, information-driven hunting. They require clear orders, known targets, structured operations. Against an enemy that does not present a fixed front, that is a fatal limitation. In internal war games, Soviet officers attempt to adapt. They add more air defenses to tank columns. They disperse formations. They simulate night operations. But each solution creates a new vulnerability. Dispersed units are easier to isolate. Air defenses reveal positions when they activate. Night operations favor the side with better sensors. Again and again, the simulations end the same way. The armored force survives longer, but it still dies. The realization is not dramatic. It is worse. It is gradual.
a creeping understanding that the foundations of Soviet ground warfare, built for a fast, decisive war in Europe, are ill-suited for a battlefield where the enemy controls the sky, the information flow, and the tempo. And hovering over it all is a darker truth. The Iraqi army did not collapse because it lacked courage. It collapsed because it never had a chance to fight on its own terms. That is the most terrifying lesson of all. If this could happen to an army equipped, trained, and organized along Soviet lines, what does that say about the Red Army itself? By late 1991, the Soviet Union is unraveling politically. Budgets shrink, units are demobilized, but the doctrinal crisis predates the collapse of the state. Even in a stronger Soviet Union, the questions raised by the Apache success would have been unavoidable. What replaces the tank at the center of warfare? What replaces mass? Some argue for more helicopters, others for better air defense integration. A few suggest something radical, abandoning the idea of decisive armored breakthroughs altogether. But no consensus emerges, because to admit the truth would mean admitting that the war the Red Army had prepared its entire existence can no longer be fought the way it imagined. In one closed seminar, a senior general, his career built on armored doctrine, addresses a room of younger officers. "The tank is not dead," he says. Then he pauses. "But it is no longer king." No one applauds. They are too busy understanding what that means. Far from the deserts of Iraq, in classrooms and briefing rooms across the Soviet Union, the Apache has done something no weapon ever should. It has made an entire military question its identity.
The question that now haunts Soviet planners is no longer what went wrong, it is what comes next. In early 1992, as the Soviet Union formally ceases to exist, its military archives remain intact. Inside them are thousands of pages devoted to a single subject: how American attack helicopters turned armored columns into burning obstacles in the desert. The laughter that once echoed in briefing rooms has vanished, replaced by something colder: professional envy. The Apache is studied not as a machine, but as a concept. Soviet engineers examine footage frame by frame. They note the mast-mounted radar that allows the helicopter to scan terrain while remaining hidden behind ridgelines. They analyze thermal imagery showing tanks glowing against the cold desert night. They trace the flight profiles, low, slow, deliberate, designed not for speed, but for invisibility. Most unsettling of all is the autonomy. Apache crews do not behave like extensions of a headquarters. They behave like hunters. Two pilots working as a single organism identify, prioritize, and destroy targets in minutes. There is no visible hesitation, no pause for permission. For a military culture built on centralized control, this is revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable. Former Soviet helicopter designers begin drafting proposals for a new generation of attack aircraft. One name appears again and again in classified documents: Ka-50. Sleek, aggressive, designed for single-pilot operation, it reflects a reluctant admission that the future favors speed of decision, not layers of approval. But even these designs struggled to replicate the Apache's true advantage, because it was never just the helicopter, it was the system behind it. The Americans had satellites feeding intelligence, AWACS aircraft mapping the battle space, drones probing ahead, ground units marking targets, every piece connected, every action reinforcing the next. The Apache was merely the executioner.
Soviet and now Russian planners recognize the gap immediately. Building a helicopter is possible. Building an information network that functions in real time across air, land, and command is vastly harder. Budgets shrink, factories close, engineers leave for civilian jobs. The theoretical future collides with harsh reality. Still, the lessons cannot be unlearned. In training exercises throughout the 1990s, former Soviet units quietly adjust their behavior. Tank formations disperse more widely. Camouflage discipline becomes obsessive. Radios are used sparingly. Movement favors darkness and weather. Yet the fear remains. If the enemy sees you first, you are already dead. This realization reshapes not just doctrine, but psychology. Armored commanders no longer think in terms of breakthroughs and momentum. They think in terms of survival windows, minutes between detection and destruction. For the first time since World War II, the tank commander feels hunted. Ironically, this mirrors the exact transformation Western forces underwent decades earlier, when they realized that massed armor could no longer operate without air supremacy. The roles have reversed. The hunter has become the hunted, and the laughter has fully disappeared. At international military conferences in the late 1990s, Russian officers listen carefully as American presenters discuss network-centric warfare. The language is technical, almost academic, but its meaning is clear. Wars will not be won by who has more tanks. They will be won by who can decide faster, who can see first, who can strike before the enemy understands what is happening. The Apache attack helicopter is no longer a joke. It is a warning, a symbol of a future that arrived without asking permission. And for those who once dismissed it as an expensive toy, the realization is brutal. By the time you stop laughing, the battlefield has already changed. The war you prepared for is gone, and the next one will not wait for you to catch up.
By the early 2000s, the verdict is no longer debated in military journals or whispered in closed briefings. It is accepted fact. The era of slow, deliberate armored warfare is over. Across former Soviet training grounds, from the frozen plains of Kazakhstan to the forests of Western Russia, new exercises reflect a quiet admission of defeat by reality. Tank crews rehearse rapid dispersal drills. Commanders practice operating with incomplete information. Air defense units are pushed forward, no longer treated as rear area assets, but as lifelines. And always, looming in the background of every scenario, is the same invisible threat: attack helicopters. Instructors replay grainy combat footage from the Gulf War. Columns of Soviet-built T-72s erupt in fire, one after another, their turrets blown clean off by precision-guided Hellfire missiles. The pauses between impacts are short, methodical, unforgiving. This is what happens, they tell their students, when you lose control of the airspace below the clouds. What haunts them is not the destruction, it is the helplessness. The crews never saw the helicopters, they never heard them, they never fired back. For veterans of the old Soviet Army, this realization cuts deep. They had been raised on the legends of Kursk, of massed armor rolling forward under artillery cover, of steel overcoming steel through sheer force of numbers. That mythology dies here, not with a climactic battle, but with silence, followed by fire. Western analysts later note that the psychological impact of attack helicopters rivaled that of the first tanks in World War I. Not because they were unstoppable, but because they shattered expectations. They attacked from angles doctrine had ignored.
They exploited vertical space the battlefield had barely considered. They turned terrain into a weapon. Hills became shields, night became camouflage, information became lethality. For American crews, the lesson was equally sobering. The Apache's success demanded flawless coordination. A missed radio call, a delayed data feed, a single exposed aircraft, and the hunter could become the prey. This was not invincibility, it was precision balanced on discipline. As conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, Iraq, and later Ukraine unfold, echoes of that lesson reappear again and again. Wherever attack helicopters dominate, armored units adapt or die. Wherever coordination fails, wreckage follows. The ghost of those burning tank columns still lingers in every modern war plan. And somewhere, buried deep in old Soviet archives, are the transcripts of those early briefings, the jokes, the smirks, the casual dismissals. They read differently now, not as confidence, but as warning signs. Because history does not punish ignorance immediately. It waits, it watches, and then it strikes, swiftly, decisively, without mercy. The Soviet generals laughed at American attack helicopters. Then they watched their tank columns disappear in flames. And by the time the laughter stopped, the battlefield had already moved on.